The storm had been building over Long Island Sound since dusk, rolling in from the Atlantic with the slow, heavy certainty of something summoned rather than formed. Lieutenant Harriet Pickens stood beneath the overhang outside the Naval Training School at Hunter College, watching the clouds thicken like bruises across the sky. The air smelled of wet concrete and ship oil drifting from the harbor, a scent she had come to associate with the war years. It reminded her of how much the world had changed and how much she had changed with it. She had never expected to wear a Navy uniform. Until a year earlier, black women had not been permitted to serve in the waves at all. When the rule finally broke in 1944, Harriet and her close friend Frances Wills were chosen as the first 2 black women ever commissioned as officers. Reporters crowded around them the day they graduated, calling it a triumph for democracy. Harriet remembered standing at attention, chin lifted, while the camera bulbs flashed. She had felt proud, but the pride was layered with something more complicated. History did not change because 2 women earned the right to stand in uniform. It changed only if the people around them chose to see them as equal. Inside the training school, the corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic. Harriet walked briskly, boots clicking in a rhythmic pace as she made her way toward the infirmary. Her shift did not begin for another hour, but she liked to arrive early. It gave her time to prepare the wards and check the supply cabinets. She had been trained in physical rehabilitation, and she took pride in the precision of her work. Treating injured sailors demanded patience as well as confidence. Many of the young men had survived torpedo strikes, fires aboard destroyers, or sudden attacks that shattered bones and burned skin. They came home carrying the weight of battles they were not ready to describe. A young sailor hurried down the hall toward her, cap tucked under his arm. He looked anxious and out of breath. "Lieutenant Pickens," he asked. "Yes, Seaman. What is it?" "There's a transport truck pulling in from the docks. Casualties from a training explosion. They're asking for medical staff now." Harriet nodded once, sharply. "Notify Ensign Harper. Tell her to meet me in Ward C. Move." The sailor sprinted away. Harriet turned in the opposite direction and quickened her pace. She had seen nights like this before. Accidents did not care whether men were in combat or in training. Explosives malfunctioned. Engines failed. Recruits pushed themselves too hard. Tonight would be one of the nights when the wards filled quickly. When she reached Ward C, 2 corpsmen were already unfolding cots and checking the oxygen tanks. The ward was bright with harsh overhead lights that cast long shadows against the tiled floor. Harriet pulled on a pair of gloves and began setting out splints, bandages, and antiseptic trays. The first gurney rolled in minutes later. The sailor atop it was conscious but shaking violently, his face streaked with soot. Harriet stepped closer. "Can you hear me, sailor?" she asked. His eyes flicked open. "Ma'am, explosion at the pier. Something went wrong with the charges." "I need you to stay awake," she said. "Tell me your name." "Reynolds. John Reynolds." "Well, John Reynolds, you're safe now. We're going to take care of you." She examined his injuries with crisp efficiency. Burns along the forearm, lacerations across the ribs. A concussion was possible, given the dull way he spoke. She guided the corpsmen as they lifted him onto a cot, then asked one to fetch cooling gels for the burns. Another gurney arrived, then another. The ward filled with the noise of men groaning, coughing, murmuring prayers under their breath. Harriet moved from one patient to the next, giving instructions, steadying trembling hands, reassuring frightened eyes. She kept her voice low and controlled, the kind of calm that made other people breathe easier. Ensign Harper arrived, cheeks flushed from running. "Lieutenant, I can take the east side of the ward." "Good," Harriet said. "Focus on the head wounds first. Anyone drifting out of consciousness needs priority." Harper nodded and stepped into motion. At the far corner of the ward, a young sailor was thrashing on the gurney, fighting the corpsman, trying to strap him down. Harriet rushed over. "What's happening?" she asked. "He's panicking, ma'am," the corpsman answered. "Shock setting in." Harriet leaned over the sailor. His eyes were wild, darting toward the window as if expecting another explosion to burst through the glass. "Look at me," Harriet said, firmly but gently. "You're in the infirmary. You're not in danger. Breathe with me." He stared at her, confused but listening. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled. He followed her lead. Another breath, then another. His hands gradually loosened. "That's it," she said. "You're all right. Let us do the rest." By midnight, the storm outside had broken, rain lashing against the windows in heavy sheets. Inside, the ward was quieter. Many of the sailors were resting. A few snored lightly. The corpsmen whispered as they worked, keeping their voices soft out of respect for the wounded. Harriet stood at the foot of a cot, checking the pulse of a sailor who had suffered a fractured leg. As she adjusted his blanket, she heard a voice behind her. "Lieutenant Pickens?" She turned. A senior officer stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Harriet straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir?" "You've done good work tonight. The men are fortunate." "Thank you, sir." He hesitated. "The commander wants the ward mopped before morning inspection. Make sure the floors are spotless." Harriet felt something tighten in her chest. She had just spent 6 hours stabilizing casualties, leading the medical response, and coordinating corpsmen under pressure. Yet this was what the officer chose to say. "I'll see that the cleaning crew is notified," she replied. "No. He wants you to do it." The words hung in the air, a sharp reminder of the boundaries the Navy had not yet erased. Harriet kept her posture rigid, refusing to let her face show the sting. "Yes, sir," she said. He gave a curt nod and left. Harper approached her, concern etched across her features. "Lieutenant, you shouldn't have to do that. Not after tonight." "It's not about what I should or shouldn't have to do," Harriet answered. "It's about what they expect." "But you're an officer." Harriet looked across the ward at the sleeping sailors, the men she had treated, soothed, and saved. Her voice was quiet. "I'm an officer when they need me," she said, "and something else when they don't." She took a mop from the supply closet and wrung it out. The scent of antiseptic filled her nose. Harper reached for a second mop. "You don't have to help," Harriet said. "I know," Harper replied, "but I will." Rain pounded against the windows as the two women worked side by side. The ward lights cast long reflections across the wet floor, shimmering like waves in a storm. By the time they finished, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. Harriet leaned on the mop handle and looked around the silent ward. The men were alive. The ward was spotless. The night was behind her. But she felt the weight of something gathering inside her. A quiet, steady resolve. This was not the last time she would be asked to choose between duty and dignity. And the Navy, she realized, was about to discover that she was capable of fighting on more than one front. The rain had stopped by the time Harriet stepped out of the ward for her next shift. but puddles still clung to the concrete like small, reflective reminders of the night before. The sunrise cast a pale band of gold along the tops of the buildings at Hunter College, and for a moment, Harriet stood quietly, breathing in the salty air drifting from the harbor. Her hands ached from hours of cleaning, her back stiff from bending over the mop, yet none of that mattered as much as the ache she carried behind her ribs. She had done everything an officer in the United States Navy was expected to do. She had led, she had healed, she had steadied frightened men who were barely old enough to shave. And still, when the ward no longer needed her expertise, she had been reduced to a task assigned as a reminder of where she truly stood. But the morning was beginning, and with morning came duty. Inside the infirmary wing, sailors limped along the corridors with the help of canes and fellow trainees. Some nodded to her respectfully. Others avoided eye contact, unsure how to act around a black female officer in a military world still adjusting to her presence. Harriet lifted her chin and returned each salute crisply. She had earned this uniform. There was power in wearing it well. At the central desk, Ensign Harper sat organizing charts. She looked up when Harriet approached. "Morning, Lieutenant," she said. "How's your back?" "I've had worse," Harriet replied. "How are the men from last night?" "Most are stable. Reynolds is awake and asking for you. Says he wants to thank you." Harriet allowed herself a small smile. "I'll see him after rounds." She gathered her clipboard and moved through Ward C. The ward looked different in the morning light. Windows glowed soft yellow, sheets were neatly folded, and the scent of antiseptic had faded into something calmer. The men were resting, talking quietly, or staring out the windows as if trying to make sense of how quickly a normal day could turn into chaos. When Harriet reached Reynolds, he shifted slightly on his cot, wincing as he tried to sit straighter. "You don't have to sit up," she said gently. "I should, ma'am," he replied. "I need to thank you properly. I remember what happened. You kept me from going under." "That's my job," she said. "You did well. You stayed conscious when it mattered." He shook his head. "Still, I ain't never been tended to by someone who looked as calm as you did." Harriet paused. She was used to gratitude, but something in his tone made her realize he had noticed more than she expected. "You saved my arm," he said. "Maybe even my life." "You're a strong young man," she replied. "You did your part?" When she left his bedside, she felt something warm stirring inside her. Moments like this were why she had fought to be here. She believed in the work. She believed she had something valuable to give. But outside the ward, the air shifted. She encountered Lieutenant Commander Braddock, a high-ranking officer whose presence always made the corridors feel colder. He was standing near the supply cabinets, speaking with another officer. When he saw Harriet, he dismissed the man and turned his attention to her. "Lieutenant Pickens," he said, voice clipped. "Sir?" "I reviewed the logs from last night's incident. I'm told you coordinated the ward." "Yes, sir." "You're not authorized to lead without direct supervision from a senior white officer." His words were plain, delivered as if they were nothing more than an administrative reminder. Harriet felt her jaw tighten. "Sir, there was no senior officer available at the time. Lives were at stake." "Regardless, ma'am," he said, "your job is to follow instructions, not to assume command." "With respect, sir," she replied, "the sailors needed immediate intervention. Had we waited, their injuries could have worsened." Braddock stared at her for a long moment. His expression did not soften. "There are procedures for a reason," he said. "I expect you to remember them, and I expect you to stay within your assigned responsibilities." "Yes, sir," Harriet answered, though the words tasted bitter. He nodded once and walked away. Harper, who had witnessed the exchange from a distance, approached cautiously. "That wasn't fair," she whispered. "It wasn't about fairness," Harriet said. "It was about reminding me where I stand." "You're an officer." "I'm an officer on paper," Harriet replied, "but not in their eyes." The two women returned to the ward, but Harriet felt the shift in atmosphere. The previous night had proved her capability, yet the morning made clear that capability threatened the fragile order the Navy was reluctant to disturb. Later, during lunch in the officers' mess, Harriet sat alone at a corner table. The chatter of other officers filled the room, but she remained apart from it, uninvited. A few nodded politely as they passed, but no one sat with her. She stirred her coffee slowly, watching the steam curl upward. Her thoughts drifted to the early months of her training when she and Francis Wills had first stepped into the Navy's world. Reporters had praised them as symbols of progress. Headlines had celebrated their achievement. But inside the Navy itself, some officers resented the federal order that forced the service to accept black women. Harriet remembered overhearing whispers. "They'll never fit in. They're only here because Washington insisted." This is a political experiment, nothing more. Those whispers had followed her everywhere, even into spaces where she excelled. She had ranked high in her coursework. She had been praised by medical instructors for her precision. Yet each accolade carried an unspoken question in the room around her. Should she have been allowed to earn it? As she sat in the mess hall, a young officer approached. She recognized him from the administrative wing. "Lieutenant Pickens?" he asked tentatively. "Yes?" "The executive staff is preparing the duty roster for next week. You're being assigned to sanitation rotations for the duration." Harriet set down her cup. "Sanitation rotations?" "Yes, ma'am. Cleaning shifts between your hours in the ward." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he thought the order was misguided or unfair. There was nothing. He seemed uncomfortable but resigned. "This is irregular," she said calmly. "Cleaning rotations are not standard for officers." "I understand, ma'am. I'm just relaying the message." He saluted and hastily withdrew. Harriet stood slowly, pushing her chair back with controlled movements. Every muscle in her body wanted to tremble, but she refused to give Braddock or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing it. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. She walked toward the barracks, each step firm, steady, deliberate. If they believed they could shame her into silence, they did not know her well enough. Her father had taught her that dignity was not given by institutions. It was held like a flame inside, fed by purpose and righteousness. When she reached the barrack steps, she paused and looked back at the training school. Men were marching in formation across the courtyard. Waves of white uniforms moved like a tide. She understood now what this chapter of her service would demand. Skill alone would not be enough. Patience alone would not be enough. She would have to withstand the weight of prejudice without letting it crush her resolve to heal the men who needed her. She straightened her shoulders and stepped inside. What awaited her in the coming weeks would test that resolve more deeply than anything she had faced so far. The smell of ether and iodine hit first, sharp and clean, cutting through the damp chill that seemed to seep from the walls of the Naval Hospital. Harriet tightened the knot of her cap under her chin as she walked down the corridor. The familiar echo of her footsteps matching the faint ticking of the clock at the nurse's station. Outside, the war raged across oceans. But in here, it spoke through bandaged limbs, scarred faces, and the silence of men who stared at the ceiling long after lights out. She checked the chart clipped to her board. Temporary assignment, Naval Hospital, Rehabilitation and Recovery Wing. The memo had been brief, but she understood what it meant. The Navy needed every trained hand it had, including hers. She had fought to be allowed to serve, and now the wounded from convoys and Atlantic patrols were being sent back in growing numbers. Destroyer men from depth charge runs, sailors from torpedoed merchant ships, air crew pulled out of cold gray water. As she pushed open the door to Ward 7B, the murmur of low voices and the steady mechanical hum of equipment met her. Rows of metal-framed beds lined the room, each one occupied. Sunlight filtered weakly through high windows, touching the blankets with thin strips of gold. Somewhere a radio played quietly, its volume turned low so as not to disturb the men who were sleeping. A corpsman glanced up as she entered. He looked no older than 20, freckles scattered across his nose. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said. "You are the new rehab officer they told us about?" "Yes," Harriet replied. "Lieutenant Pickens, what have we got in here?" "Mostly shrapnel, burns, and fractures, ma'am. Couple of lung injuries from smoke inhalation. Some of them are due to go back stateside when they are stronger. Some are hoping to return to duty." Harriet looked down the rows of beds. Faces young and older, skin pale or tanned by long hours at sea, eyes weary. She stepped to the first bed. The sailor lying there had his right arm in a sling, bandages visible beneath the white cloth. He watched her approach with cautious curiosity. "Good morning," she said. "I am Lieutenant Pickens. How are you feeling?" "Like I lost a fight with a boiler, ma'am," he answered. "But I guess I am still here." "What is your name?" "Lewis. Arthur Lewis. From a destroyer escort out of Norfolk. Or what is left of her, anyway." She studied his chart briefly. Shrapnel wounds, shoulder and upper arm. Surgery completed. Prognosis good with proper rehabilitation. "We will work on getting your strength back," she said. "You took damage, but the arm is still yours. That counts for something." He eyed her sleeve. "Rehab, ma'am. Thought most of that was handled by the white lady doctors." "Most of it is handled by the people who are trained for it," Harriet replied, her voice steady. "That includes me." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She moved from bed to bed, checking charts, asking questions, listening to stories that started on convoys in the North Atlantic or in cramped engine rooms where fires could rage in an instant. One sailor, his head wrapped in gauze, grinned when she approached and said he never thought he would be knocked flat by a ladder instead of an enemy shell. Another described the eerie quiet that settled in after a torpedo struck his ship. The way men moved in a daze through smoke and steam. Harriet listened, asked about pain levels, adjusted pillows, and made notes on who would be able to start simple mobility exercises that afternoon. Every movement she suggested was calculated. Flex, hold, release. A leg raised against resistance, fingers curled slowly into a fist. She knew that getting a man to move again after injury was as much about his mind as his muscles. The body hesitated when it remembered pain. Near the center of the ward, a curtain had been drawn halfway around a bed. The chart clipped at the foot read, "Carter, Samuel J., Gunner's mate, age 21. Extensive burns along upper torso and arms, limited mobility in both hands. Harriet parted the curtain gently. The young man on the bed turned his head with effort. His skin was mottled with healing burns, pink and tender, some areas still bandaged. His gaze fixed on her uniform first, then her face. "Lieutenant," he said quietly. "Gunner's mate Carter," she replied. "How are you managing?" He gave a tiny shrug that made him wince. "I was better when I thought I would go back on a ship. They told me yesterday that is not happening." Harriet glanced at the notes. Function in his hands might be partially restored, but not to the degree required for heavy weapon handling at sea. "I am sorry," she said. "I signed up to fight," he replied. "Now I am told I will be lucky if I can grip a tool instead of a gun." Harriet moved closer, her expression softening. "The fight is not only out there on the water. It is also here, in this bed, in this room, every time you decide to push through another inch of pain to regain what you can." He let out a rough breath. "Do you really believe that?" "Yes," she said. "I do." He stared at her as if searching for any sign that she might be repeating a line she did not mean. Finally, he nodded once. "Then, what do we do first?" he asked. "We start with your hands," she replied. "Small movements. You will hate me for it by the end of the day." A faint ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Then I suppose I will be in good company, ma'am. The Japs already tried to kill me. Might as well have a lieutenant finish the job." She picked up a small rubber ball from the bedside tray. "Hold this, just for 10 seconds. His fingers trembled as he tried to close them around it. The effort pulled at newly healed skin, sending pain shooting up his arms. His breathing quickened. Harriet counted aloud, voice calm and steady. 7, 8, 9, 10. Release. The ball rolled from his palm. Sweat gathered at his hairline. "That felt like an hour," he whispered. "Tomorrow it will feel like 50 seconds, she said. "Next week, 20. You will not notice when it becomes 10 again." She stayed with him a little longer, guiding his breathing through the next attempt. His jaw clenched with each effort, but he did not quit. She had seen that look before, in athletes pushing through training and in workers fighting exhaustion during long shifts. It was the same grit, redirected onto a battlefield carved across his own body. By afternoon, the ward hummed with slow, deliberate motion. Men lifted arms, flexed legs, rolled shoulders, and sat at the edge of their beds with determination. Some joked with each other, trying to lighten the weight of their shared burden. Others stayed quiet, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon where they might one day stand fully upright again. Between sessions, Harriet stepped out into the corridor to update charts. As she bent over the paperwork at the nurse's station, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Lieutenant Pickens." She turned to see Lieutenant Commander Braddock. His posture was as rigid as ever. "Yes, sir?" "I see you're making yourself useful," he said, glancing toward the ward. "The chief medical officer notes your skill with the rehabilitation cases." "Thank you, sir," she replied. "Do not misunderstand me," he added. "You are here because regulations allow it. But do not expect your presence to change the structure of this organization." Harriet held his gaze. "I am here to do my duty, sir. The structure is your concern. The men are mine." His expression tightened for a fraction of a second. "There will be an inspection this evening," he said. "I expect the floors of your ward to be spotless." You will see to it personally between sessions." Her grip tightened around the clipboard. "Sir, my scheduled hours are dedicated to rehabilitation exercises. The courseman can handle the sanitation." "That is an order, Lieutenant," he said. "We cannot afford to let standards slip." She felt the old, familiar heat of anger flare behind her ribs. But she did not let it reach her face. The humiliation was not new. Being ordered to scrub and clean despite her rank and training had become part of the rhythm of her service. While white nurses prepared charts and planned rotations, she would be down on her knees, wiping away footprints and streaks of iodine. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. When he left, Harriet stood still for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds from the ward behind her. The men who were gripping rubber balls and trying to lift bruised limbs had no idea that the officer guiding them would soon be judged by the shine of the floor, instead of the strength she helped them reclaim. Harper found her in the corridor later, a pail and mop already waiting against the wall. "Again?" Harper asked softly. "Again?" Harriet answered. They worked in silence that evening, pushing soapy water across the tiles between the beds, careful not to disturb the men who slept. A few woke and watched in confusion as an officer in navy blue uniform knelt beside their cots, scrubbing the floor where their crutches rested. One man tried to sit up. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be doing that," he whispered. Harriet paused, met his eyes, then gave him a small, measured smile. "It seems the Navy disagrees," she said. "You just focus on healing. Let me worry about the rest." As she wrung out the mop, water dripping back into the bucket, she felt the anger shift inside her, cooling and hardening into something else. Resentment alone would not sustain her through this. What would sustain her was the knowledge that every time a man took one more step, every time a burned hand closed around an object again, she was striking back against the narrow version of service the Navy tried to confine her to. The courage bleeding through the bandages in Ward 7B was real. So was the quiet battle being fought in the spaces where she was told to kneel. The war, she understood now, was not only across oceans. It was right here, beneath the pale hospital lights, in the fight to be seen as the officer she already was. And as the floors of the ward dried to a dull, regulation-approved shine, Harriet knew she was nowhere near finished. Winter settled over New York with a quiet heaviness, the kind that seeped through stone buildings and under door frames long before dawn. At the Naval Hospital, frost clung to the windows like a soft film, muting the outside world. Inside, the morning bell sounded, echoing down the corridors with the same steady rhythm it always carried. But for Harriet Pickens, this morning felt different. She sensed it the way sailors sensed a change in weather, a shift in the air, a tightening of something unseen. The day before, she had received a memo stamped with the insignia of the hospital's executive office, a reassignment order. No explanation, no discussion. It simply stated that Lieutenant Harriet Ida Pickens was to report to the administrative wing at 0600 for new duties pending review. As she made her way through the corridor, sailors greeted her with nods and salutes. A few of the recovering men called her name from their beds as she passed Ward 7B. "Lieutenant Pickens, are we doing hand drills this afternoon?" "Ma'am, I almost opened the jar they gave me yesterday." She smiled genuinely as each one spoke. Their progress had become the anchor of her days, something no administrative officer could take from her. But the memo weighed heavily in her pocket, its folded edges cutting ever so slightly against her fingertips. Harper intercepted her at the junction outside the administrative wing. "Harriet?" she whispered, lowering her voice. I heard something. Braddock has been talking to the board. Harriet stopped. About what? They're saying you've overstepped. That your presence disrupts the chain of command. That some officers feel uncomfortable with how much responsibility you've taken. Harriet exhaled slowly, controlling the flare of anger in her chest. Uncomfortable, she repeated. That's the word they use. I don't think this reassignment is routine, Harper said. Be careful. Harriet nodded once. I'm always careful. She entered the administrative office precisely at 600. Lieutenant Commander Braddock stood beside a table stacked with files. 3 other officers were seated behind him, their expressions polite, in the way people look when watching something unpleasant but inevitable. Lieutenant Pickens, Braddock said. You're punctual. Good. Sir, she replied. You are being reassigned to logistical support and interior maintenance until further notice. The words hit her like a blow. Logistical support sounded respectable on paper, but the phrase interior maintenance hung in the air with unmistakable intent. It meant sanitation, cleaning, floors and latrines, duties rarely assigned to officers and never assigned to white nurses. Sir, she said carefully, my commission is as a rehabilitation specialist. My work with the wounded will be covered by others, Braddock interrupted. Your presence in the ward has created tension. Tension? She asked. Among who, sir? The men under my care? Or the officers above them? Braddock's eyes narrowed. You are dangerously close to insubordination. I am asking for clarification, sir. One of the officers behind him cleared his throat, an older man with graying hair. We have received reports, he said, that your behavior has occasionally conflicted with established hierarchy and expectations. This reassignment is temporary. A corrective measure. Corrective. The word settled heavily between them. Harriet inhaled slowly. Her father had warned her about moments like this. Moments where silence and dignity were weapons sharper than any blade. Understood, sir, she said. Braddock nodded with an air of victory. You will begin today. Report to the facility sergeant for task assignments. Dismissed. Harriet saluted, turned on her heel, and walked out without allowing a single muscle in her face to falter. The sergeant looked confused when she presented herself. Ma'am, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I've never had an officer assigned to my division. I am here under orders, she said. Assign whatever tasks are needed. Within the hour, she was handed a bucket, a stack of rags, and a list of rooms to sanitize. Storage halls, utility closets, base bathrooms. By mid-morning, she had scrubbed tile floors until her arms ached. Sweat gathered under her collar. The chemical sting of disinfectant filled her nose. Twice, junior enlisted men passed by and stopped abruptly, startled to see a Navy officer kneeling with a brush in hand. Ma'am, let me take that, one of them said. No, she replied firmly. You have your duties. I have mine. He hesitated, saluted awkwardly, and moved on, confusion clouding his face. Harriet continued scrubbing. Each stroke of the brush felt like a test designed not to measure her physical endurance, but to wear down something deeper. Her pride, her sense of belonging, her belief that she could change the institution she served. But the more she worked, the clearer it became that they had underestimated her. She had survived rigorous officer training. She had broken barriers the Navy had only reluctantly allowed to fall. She had tended to the wounded with skill, compassion, an unshakable calm. And she had done all of it while walking under the weight of prejudice. A bucket and scrub brush were not going to break her. Late that afternoon, Harper found her in a disused corridor, wiping down metal cabinets. "Harriet," she whispered urgently, "this is outrageous." "It's strategic," Harriet replied, her voice steady. "They want me to feel small. They want me to question whether I belong." "You do belong." Harriet paused, resting her hands against the cool metal. "I know, and they know. That's why they're doing this." Harper looked around angrily. "The men in Ward 7B asked for you. They said the exercises don't feel the same without you." A warmth stirred in Harriet's chest, unexpectedly fierce. The sailors had noticed. They cared. She had made a difference so real that even pain-hardened men recovering from war wounds felt her absence. "Harper," she said softly, "tell them I'll be back." "You think they'll let you return?" "I think the Navy is a large machine," Harriet replied, "and even machines miscalculate." She wrung out her cloth and continued cleaning. Harper stayed with her, working silently beside her without being asked. That evening, after the last room on her list was finished, Harriet stepped into the cold courtyard outside the barracks. A long plume of breath left her lips as she looked up at the darkening sky. A thin moon hung above the buildings, pale and resilient. She thought of the men in the wards. She thought of the countless stories of Black Americans who had served the nation with excellence only to face exclusion, suspicion, or humiliation. Her service was one thread in a much larger tapestry. She was not alone. She was not the first. And she would not be the last. Somewhere inside the hospital, Lieutenant Commander Braddock likely believed he had put her in her place. But Harriet knew something he did not. People break when they lose their purpose, not when they are forced to scrub floors. Her purpose remained entirely intact, and she could already feel a turning point taking shape, rising quietly beneath the surface like a current ready to shift the tide. The Navy had tested her strength. They were about to learn it ran deeper than they ever imagined. Snow drifted across the parade grounds in quiet spirals, blown by winds sweeping in from the harbor. The Naval Hospital buildings stood stiff against the cold, their brick walls rimed with frost. Inside, warmth clung stubbornly to the radiators, but nothing in the winter air eased the heaviness that had settled on Harriet Pickens' shoulders. She had spent 2 weeks under reassignment, shifting between cleaning orders and clerical tasks that left her abilities unused, her training untouched. The cost of it was beginning to show. Not in her work ethic, not in her posture, but in the moments she was finally alone, when the exhaustion she carried pressed inward like a weight she could not set down. That morning, she sat on the edge of her bunk, fastening the buttons of her uniform with steady hands. Across from her, Frances Wills, her closest friend, her fellow trailblazer, the other half of the Navy's first Black women officers, watched her quietly. "You're working too many hours," Frances said at last, "and bending to too many insults." Harriet didn't look up. "I'm following orders." "No," Frances replied, her voice gentle. "You're absorbing them." Harriet paused, the final button still undone. She lifted her eyes. Frances had always been able to read the truth beneath her composure. "It's temporary," Harriet said, though she didn't quite believe it. Frances shook her head. "They're testing you, but you're testing yourself too. You can't carry both battles alone. The truth of the words stung. Harriet closed the final button and stood. I'll be late for assignment if I don't go. Harriet, Frances said softly, don't forget why you're here. Harriet hesitated, then nodded and left the room. Her assignment that morning was clerical. Stacks of personnel reports waited on her desk, pages thin and crisp under her fingertips. She typed revisions with precise strokes, her posture the picture of discipline. Yet with each paper she filed, she felt the widening gap between who she was trained to be and what she was being relegated to. At mid-morning, she received a call from the rehabilitation ward. Lieutenant Pickens, the voice said. It's Seaman Ellis in 7B. Ma'am, some of the men. They've been asking to see you. Her breath caught. Has there been a change in their condition? No, ma'am, just... Well, some have refused their exercises unless you supervise. They said you're the reason they got this far. Harriet closed her eyes briefly. A warmth surged in her chest, equal parts pride and sorrow. Tell them I can't visit during work hours, she said, but tell them I'm proud of them. Yes, ma'am. But they miss you. She hung up slowly. This was the cost. Being kept away from the work she'd been trained for. Being denied the chance to help the sailors who believed in her. Being reminded every day that recognition for her skill only mattered until someone decided it shouldn't. The battle against segregation was a cold, steady grind. The battle within her, the fight to not let resentment cloud her purpose, was something fiercer. She returned to her typing, her fingers moving faster now, the tension winding silently through her shoulders. By afternoon, she was reassigned again, this time to inventory work in the basement storage rooms. The air there was cold and metallic, filled with the scent of oil and rust. Shelves held stretchers, medical kits, spare uniforms. She moved through the dim corridors with a clipboard, checking serial numbers, marking shortages. Footsteps echoed faintly behind her. You're a hard woman to find. It was Chief Medical Officer Danforth, a man who had always addressed her with crisp professionalism. He approached slowly, hands tucked behind his back. Sir, Harriet said, straightening. I visited Ward 7B today, he said. Several of the men told me their rehabilitation has stalled. They say the exercises are not being run with the same precision. Harriet remained still. Lieutenant, Danforth continued, I've also reviewed your reassignment orders. They came from above my office. Yes, sir. He studied her for a long moment. You were one of the best officers in that ward. You know that. The words landed gently, but they reopened something raw. With respect, sir, knowing it hasn't been enough, Harriet said. No, it hasn't, he conceded, but I want you to understand something. Your work proved something important, not just to the men, to this hospital. Harriet lowered her gaze. It proved something to me as well, that the barriers in this institution are not built from lack of skill or need. They're built to maintain a comfort some officers believe they're entitled to. Danforth looked at her carefully. You're not wrong. The admission surprised her. He stepped closer. You're fighting two battles, Lieutenant. The Navy asks you to fight a war overseas, but your service demands another battle here, one you never volunteered for. Harriet's throat tightened. Most can manage one battle, he said. Few can carry two. and fewer still can do so with dignity. She swallowed. Sometimes I wonder how much dignity I have left. You have more than most officers in this building, he replied, including the ones who outrank you. It was the closest thing she had received to official support. And though he could not reverse her reassignment, the acknowledgement steadied her more than she expected. When he turned to leave, he paused. The men in Ward 7B haven't given up on you. Neither should you. After he left, Harriet stood alone in the dim storage corridor, holding the clipboard loosely at her side. The distant hum of generators vibrated through the concrete floor. 2 battles, 1 uniform, and she would not abandon either. As evening approached, Harriet returned to the barracks. She was walking up the stone steps when she saw a figure waiting in the shadow of the doorway. A young sailor, Carter, the burn victim from 7B. He straightened when he saw her. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not supposed to be out of the ward, but I needed to tell you something." "Carter, you should be resting." "I can grip the ball now," he interrupted. "Both hands. And I kept practicing even after they moved you out." Her breath caught. "You told me I would hate you for the exercises," he said with a small smile. "But I hated them less when you weren't there. Somehow that felt worse." She didn't know what to say. For a moment, words simply wouldn't come. "I thought you should know," he added. "We're not done fighting either." He saluted awkwardly, stiffly, then turned and shuffled back toward the ward. Harriet remained on the steps, the winter wind brushing cold against her cheeks. She felt the truth settle deep within her. Every day she spent being diminished, she was still part of a story larger than the men who tried to limit her. The sailors she helped were living proof that her presence mattered. Her work mattered. Her endurance mattered. The cost of fighting 2 battles was heavy. But the cost of surrender would have been far greater. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped inside. The storm around her had not passed. But Harriet Pickens had stopped fearing storms long ago. The February dawn rose gray and brittle over the Naval Hospital grounds, its weak light filtering through layers of frost that clung to window frames and railings. Harriet Pickens walked briskly across the courtyard, her breath blooming in white clouds. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke, a reminder that the boilers were struggling again in the cold. Her boots struck the pavement with a steady rhythm, each step echoing a resolve that had hardened over weeks of humiliation, reassignment, and the quiet erosion of her rightful place in the Navy. Today she sensed something was different. Not because the institution had changed, but because she had. She reported first to the facilities wing, where she'd been spending much of her time in recent weeks. Sergeant Wilcox looked up as she entered, rubbing warmth into his gloved hands. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said. "Got the usual for you." He held out a clipboard filled with cleaning assignments, hallways, stairwells, latrines. The list seemed longer than usual. Intentional, no doubt. Harriet took the clipboard, but she didn't move. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "I need to check on something in Ward 7B before starting this. Medical priority." Wilcox blinked. "Ma'am, I don't think your CO will like you leaving your post." "My CO isn't here," she replied. "The wounded are." And she turned before he could answer. Her heart beat faster as she approached the ward. She wasn't scheduled for medical duty. She wasn't authorized to step back into a role she had been removed from. But the reassignment orders had come at a cost far beyond her own dignity. Men recovering from burns, fractures, and shrapnel wounds had stalled in their progress. Some had lost confidence. Some had refused exercises altogether. She pushed open the ward door. The room was quiet, lit by the soft amber glow of morning. A few sailors sat up when they saw her. One nudged the man beside him, whispering urgently. Carter, the young burn victim, lifted a shaky hand. "Lieutenant Pickens," he called. "Ma'am." Harriet approached him. "You should be resting." "I rest too much these days," he said with a wry smile. "But I'm doing what you taught me." He held up a rubber ball. He squeezed it. Once. Twice. His hand still trembled from the effort, but he managed it. Harriet felt a warmth bloom in her chest. "That's excellent," she said softly. "You keep going. 10 seconds today, 12 tomorrow." The men nearby straightened, as if her presence alone breathed energy back into the ward. "Ma'am, when are you coming back?" one of them asked. "Ma'am, the exercises aren't the same without you." Harriet opened her mouth to answer, but a sharp voice cut through the room. "Lieutenant Pickens?" Lieutenant Commander Braddock stood at the doorway, framed by the morning light. His expression was cold enough to match the frost outside. "Sir," Harriet said calmly. "You are not assigned to this ward," he said. "You are to be downstairs. Now." The men in the room watched, silent but alert. Harriet felt their eyes on her, waiting to see whether she would shrink or stand. "I will go momentarily," she said. "But I needed to check the condition of these patients. Their progress has slowed significantly." "That is because the officers assigned to them are following proper protocol," Braddock snapped. "You, Lieutenant, have been disruptive to the chain of—" "With respect, sir," Harriet interjected, her voice steady but firm. "Their rehabilitation requires trained oversight. I was commissioned specifically to provide that." Braddock's eyes flashed. "You were commissioned because Washington forced our hand. Don't forget that." A stunned hush filled the ward. Harriet stood perfectly still, every muscle tight. Slowly she straightened. "Forcing the Navy to acknowledge who is fit to serve is not a burden," she said. "It is a correction." Braddock took a step forward. "You are out of line." "No, sir," Harriet replied. "I am precisely where I should be." Behind her, Carter whispered, "Tell him, Lieutenant." Harriet did not look back, but she heard the quiet ripple of agreement among the men. Braddock's voice sharpened. "You will return to your sanitation post immediately, or face disciplinary action." Harriet met his stare without blinking. For weeks, she had endured humiliation in silence. She had accepted cleaning duty, clerical grunt work, and accusations of insubordination simply for performing her job with excellence. But this moment, this exact moment, was where the line could no longer hold. "Sir," she said, "I will not abandon the men who depend on my training. Not today, not after everything we've worked for. If you wish to discipline me, you may. But I will not apologize for fulfilling the role I earned." A pulse of astonishment passed through the ward. Braddock's face reddened. "You have no authority to make decisions here." "Then let the chief medical officer make them," she said. And as if conjured by justice itself, a voice from the doorway replied, "I believe I will." Danforth stepped into the room, coat still dusted with snow. He looked between Harriet and Braddock and then addressed the ward. "Lieutenant Pickens was reviewed without my consultation," he said. "And the quality of rehabilitation has declined since. That ends today. Braddock stiffened. Sir, regulations? Regulations also dictate that officers be assigned according to skill, Danforth interrupted. And Lieutenant Pickens is one of the most skilled rehabilitation officers in this facility. The men murmured in approval. She will resume her medical duties immediately, Danforth declared. And she will no longer be assigned to cleaning or maintenance shifts. Braddock opened his mouth, but Danforth raised a hand. I have already informed the executive board. If this hospital intends to uphold its commitment to the United States Navy, then it will do so without sabotaging its own officers. Braddock's jaw clenched. He saluted stiffly, turned, and left the ward. Only after he disappeared did Harriet realize her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the release of something she had held inside for too long. Danforth stepped closer. Lieutenant, he said quietly, you earned this. Never let them convince you otherwise. Thank you, sir, she said. But the gratitude she felt was not for the reinstatement. It was for the acknowledgement of a truth she had always known, but had been forced to defend again and again. She turned to the sailors. All right, she said, voice warming. Exercises begin now. Let's show them what real progress looks like. A cheer rose from the beds and chairs. Carter lifted his ball again, determined. Lewis adjusted his sling and sat straighter. Men who had felt forgotten suddenly looked alive with purpose. Harriet moved through the ward, guiding them with the same calm confidence she had carried since the day she first put on the uniform. But today, something was different. Today, she stood not only as an officer. Today, she stood as a woman who refused to bow her head. And as the winter light slowly filled the room, Harriet Pickens reclaimed the place she had fought for, the place she had earned, the place no one would take from her again.